All right, let's talk about AI risk. When we hear that phrase, I think our minds usually jump straight to the sci-fi stuff, rogue robots taking over the planet, that kind of thing. But listen, the reality is much more immediate. The true dangers of artificial intelligence right now lie in things like biased data, opaque decisions, and the very real impact it's having on your job today. In this explainer, we're going to unpack exactly what happens when deploying AI goes from being a handy operational tool to a serious operational harm, and more importantly, how we can implement the accountability imperative to actually protect ourselves.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The AI risk landscape, 2. Inside the black box, 3. Adapting your career, 4. AI and law enforcement, and finally, 5. The trust equation. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The AI risk landscape. It's actually kind of a fascinating concept, right? AI risk isn't just some random technical glitch. It's really an ecosystem problem. It emerges from the model's design, the data selection, and the massive operational scale. When you apply that kind of scale, models can literally entrench historical inequalities. And because the danger itself is so deeply layered, well, our controls have to be layered too. But to actually mitigate that risk, we've got to make it visible first. Here are the core categories we're looking at. You have bias, where historical data reproduces old discrimination. There's privacy leaks, weaponization by bad actors, and by the way, think automated phishing here, not just missiles. Then we've got job displacement, disinformation spreading through deepfakes, and opacity. Building responsible AI means staring all these risks down before you ever hit deploy. So, how do we actually fight back against that? Well, it takes these 3 layers working in total harmony. First, technical controls. Think bias audits. Second, organizational controls, which require things like internal ethics boards. And finally, regulatory controls, bringing in government frameworks like the NIST Risk Framework and the EU AI Act. The absolute crucial takeaway here? Inclusive design is a fundamental risk control. It is not just some PR band-aid you slap on at the end to look good. Moving on to Section 2, Inside the Black Box.
Okay, so what exactly do we mean when we say black box AI? Basically, we're talking about completely opaque systems where the logic, the learned weights inside the model are totally hidden from us. And this gets incredibly dangerous when these systems are trusted with high-impact decisions. Think about it. Who gets hired? Who gets a mortgage? Who gets granted parole? For decisions with consequences this massive, explainability isn't just a nice-to-have feature. It's a strict, non-negotiable requirement.
Let's break down the mechanics here. Think about your inputs, the data, the features, versus your outputs, a score or a recommendation. Right in the middle of those two things is that black box, and it creates what we call an accountability gap. If a consequence deeply affects the real person, and literally no one can explain why the machine chose that specific output, well, it's impossible to audit, it's impossible to appeal, and it's impossible to assign responsibility.
Which brings us to Section 3, Adapting Your Career.
Now, if you take nothing else away from this, I want you to memorize this one powerful mantra: automation, augmentation, adaptation. This is the workforce pattern of the future for sure. AI automates the repeatable chores, it augments your human capabilities, but because tasks are shifting incredibly fast right now, adaptation is required from you. Your role has to intentionally pivot to focus heavily on human judgment and on rigorously verifying those AI outputs. Let's see how this actually plays out in the real world across a few different industries. Looking at this breakdown, ask yourself right now, what tasks in my specific job are being automated, and what decisions absolutely must remain human? Like in healthcare, AI is great at handling diagnostics, but clinical judgment, that is the protected human advantage. In legal, AI speeds up the heavy research, but original judgment and ethics remain firmly human. Your career safety lies in cultivating that unique human advantage.
To give you some immediate traction, here's a 5-step career adaptation playbook. First, map your tasks. Literally write them down and separate the repeatable stuff from the judgment-heavy work. Second, identify the AI tools that can assist you. Third, rigorously verify the outputs. Always check for assumptions and biases. Fourth, reskill intentionally by building up both your domain literacy and your AI literacy. And fifth, govern your use by setting clear rules for human review. That is how you proactively protect your career against displacement.
All right, let's raise the stakes. Section 4, AI in law enforcement. Look, when AI enters the criminal justice system, the margin for error basically drops to 0. Here, we are trying to balance public safety with fundamental civil liberties. An oversight, a biased training set, or an unquestioned AI error in this space
doesn't just mean a lost job or a denied credit card. It can literally cost a human being their freedom. Because the reality is, AI is already deeply embedded in policing. We're talking license plate readers, real-time video surveillance, predictive policing, gunshot detection, the whole shebang. But what you really need to understand is that every single one of these carries a drastically different accuracy profile. A flaw in a license plate reader, that's an annoyance. A flaw in facial recognition, that can mean a false arrest. They have vastly different exposures to civil liberties violations.
So how does bias actually creep into the justice system in the first place? Well, it's a whole life cycle problem. It starts all the way back with historical data, where past, biased policing patterns just become future signals. That bad data feeds into unrepresentative training sets. Then, the subjective choices made during feature design literally shape what the system sees. This flawed logic leads to deployment, which turns into real-world enforcement pressure. And if oversight is weak, the harm stays hidden, leading directly to flawed courtroom outcomes. That's why, when AI-derived evidence is actually used in a real investigation, strict procedural safeguards are absolutely mandatory to maintain accountability. First, the raw data is captured. Second, the model generates an output. But critically, step 3, a human officer must validate, review, and corroborate it with error checks. Then, the process has to be disclosed for explainability and discovery before it can finally be used in court. A trained human must always remain in the loop and accountable for the final enforcement action. And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, the trust equation. So true governance really requires robust legal frameworks. And we are starting to see the development of some vital rules, like the EU AI Act and the White House AI Bill of Rights, running right alongside our established constitutional protections. But rules alone just aren't enough without transparency. We absolutely need mandatory public impact assessments, independent community boards, and mandatory human-in-the-loop reviews. That is the structural shield that actually protects citizens. Ultimately, all of these different frameworks point toward one single goal, the trust equation, because societal trust in AI isn't just freely given, it has to be actively calculated. Trust equals visible rules that everyone can understand, plus measurable outcomes that actually prove fairness, plus meaningful recourse. Why? Because when a system gets it wrong, and trust me, it will, the affected person must have a crystal clear path to appeal. So we've explored the hidden dangers, the massive career shifts coming our way, the extremely high-stakes world of public safety, and the blueprints for governance. But the final piece of the puzzle isn't a framework at all. It's you. Whether you're a developer, a hiring manager, or just a concerned community member, how are you going to demand responsible, accountable AI in your own sphere? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and remember, keep asking the tough questions.